Hello. In this talk I start around 1900 and ask a series of questions about the nature of art. I believe these questions lie at the heart of much of the art of the last 120 years, but particularly the last 70 years. Now, with this talk I don't want to problematise art, that is, turn art into a problem to be solved. I hope instead that the questions that I raise will provoke some new thoughts when you next look at some modern art. Now, when Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque were working closely together in Paris, developing the style now called Cubism, Braque said afterwards, "It was like being roped together on a mountain." So what was this mountain they were climbing? It was no less, I think, than a new way of seeing the world. So how do we see the world in a new way? Well, in 1934, Ezra Pound wrote "Make It New," which is a call to reject all forms of past thought, representation and culture. Innovation and experimentation are the essence of modern art, the art of the 20th century. So let's climb the mountain of modern art using 15 steps that I've selected, 15 questions based on some of the most difficult art of the 20th century. And each step is a question which I believe raises profound issues. In other words, there's no right or wrong answer to each question. It just raises issues to consider. So my aim is not to answer the questions, it's to encourage you to think further about them. With all these artworks and questions, in a way, I'm not really concerned about the art at all. Modern art concerns itself with the human condition and our way of responding to it. It's often shocking, sometimes it's trite, sometimes obscure. One sometimes wonders who it's produced for, perhaps the artists themselves, or everyone, or the art elite. Most artists want to reach out to as many people as possible, but we find that works of art, works of modern art, are sometimes dismissed as trivial with phrases like, "What's it about? It must have taken 5 minutes. My child could do it," or "It's just trying to shock." So here's an example of that with my first question. What is art anyway? This urinal was voted by a poll of 500 art experts as the most influential artwork of the 20th century. Why? Well, in order to understand that, let me tell you a story. And this story means that I want you to imagine it's April 1917 and you are a director of the board of the American Society of Independent Artists in New York. It's 1917, so it's the middle of World War I in Europe. And as a result, many European artists have come to New York. And you and the board see the opportunity to overtake Paris as the leading centre of modern art. To help achieve this, you've announced that artists could be certain that if they pay the entry fee, whatever they send will be exhibited. However, you've just been called to an emergency board meeting as an artist called Richard Mutt has submitted this, a urinal turned 90 degrees with the title Fountain. It's signed R. Mutt 1917. This is a photograph of the original urinal, which is now lost. And you have to decide whether to exhibit the work. What do you think? Is it worth exhibiting? Is it a joke? Is it obscene? Is it a work of art? The entry fee was paid but maybe it was submitted as a joke. Remember, though, you promised to exhibit anything properly entered. As you believed, the more extreme the art, the more likely you are to overtake Paris. Right. Would you like to know what the board decided? Well, by a narrow majority, they decided to reject it. Some on the board thought it was indecent, and that's indicated by newspapers which, when they spoke about it, they used the term bathroom appliance, as urinal was too shocking for its readers. Some members of the board called it unoriginal. An odd word. I assume this meant the artist, or they thought the artist had not used any skill in making it, but simply bought it from a shop. It is, of course, very original if accepted as a work of art. Now, what you didn't know, what the board didn't know, was that the work was submitted by a fellow board director, Marcel Duchamp, using the false name Richard Mutt. And as a result of your decision not to accept Fountain, Duchamp resigned together with another fellow director. Because the two of them felt that at the heart of this matter is who makes the decision, and they felt no committee could or should judge whether a new innovative work was art or not. It was arbitrary censorship. By the way, you might be wondering, why did Duchamp submit a urinal of all things? Was he testing the committee? Undoubtedly he was. He did actually tell a New York newspaper later, a great deal of modern art is meant to be amusing. So maybe it's a bit of a joke. But in a sense it was serious, because he really was testing the board, and he did resign. There is another related possibility. He'd already been experimenting with the idea of found objects as art. He called them ready-mades. He'd already mounted a bicycle wheel he found on top of a kitchen stool. He'd already chosen a bottle dryer as a ready-made. So what is a ready-made? You might think he selected the urinal because it looks beautiful, the curves of the basin. Maybe they remind you of a hooded Madonna or a seated Buddha. But he told us later none of that applies. He never selected a ready-made because he thought it looked aesthetic. It was purely a found objects like a hair comb or a snow shovel, both of which, incidentally, he also selected as ready-mades. He was making the point that at one level a work of art was created simply by an artist choosing an object and presenting it as a work of art. He was bypassing the association of art with physical skill and presenting an idea. He was exposing and rejecting the role of institutions in defining what is art and drawing our attention to the particularity of an otherwise anonymous, mass-produced object. Much later, in 1959, Duchamp was asked on a BBC radio programme if he considered ready-mades art, and he gave a more profound answer. He said they were a form of denying the possibility of defining art. That's worth unpacking. He was saying it's impossible to define art, and his urinal demonstrates that. Whatever you come up with as a definition of art, he, a well-known artist, will produce something that does not conform to your definition. So he was submitting this to make the point that art is not something that anyone can define or make a judgment on. It's something an artist produces. These, of course, they were particularly and still are controversial ideas. As someone complained at the time, if the urinal was art, an artist might as well put a pile of manure on a canvas and call it art. And in fact, as we now know, that's true, and that has been done. Fountain became one of the most discussed and influential works of the 20th century. No one said it was the greatest work of the 20th century, but it's caused so much discussion about what is art. It remains enigmatic and still sits there raising the same question, am I art? These were painted by Pablo Picasso when he was 14 and 15. Needless to say, he was a child prodigy. The one on the right, First Communion, was his first large-scale painting. He produced it at art school, and it was exhibited at a major exhibition in Barcelona, and was mentioned in the press. It conforms to many of the expectations of academic art at the time, at the end of the 19th century. There's a young Catholic girl kneeling before the altar. It's a dramatic moment in her life. It's what critics, visitors to an exhibition would expect of a painting. The question here is, yes, but are there other ways the world can be represented? Well, shortly a few years later, in February 1901, a tragedy occurred. He'd been in Paris but returned to Madrid. And when he was in Madrid, he heard his close friend, Carlos Casagemas, had died in Paris. Now, Casagemas was in love with a woman called Germaine, but she rejected him. She wasn't interested. So he took a revolver to the cafe where she was with friends drinking, shot at her, and then shot himself. Now, she escaped. I think she had a minor wound, but he died. Picasso returned and stayed in Casagemas's room where he'd spent his last few days. In fact, Picasso began an affair with Germaine, typical Picasso, as she was the woman Casagemas had loved and for whom he'd committed suicide. Picasso later wrote that I started painting in blue when I learned of Casagemas's death, and this is one painting from his blue period, The Tragedy. Picasso worked and reworked this painting at least 4 times, and he didn't scrape off the old painting. He painted over the top, and he painted over the top again and again. The man's shoulders, for example, in one of the paintings below it, is the head of a horse in a bull ring. Picasso said he believed what comes out at the end of all of that is what he called the sum of destructions. Later, Picasso spent 6 months preparing for this painting. He produced hundreds of sketches, drawings, some say without parallel for a single picture in the entire history of art. Originally, for example, there was a sailor and a medical student in the room. This is not a conventional painting with a narrative. It's an exploration of the nature of painting and the nature of representation. When it was first shown in 1916, even his friends and supporters were dismayed. One said, "What a loss to French art." Henri Matisse was angry because he thought Picasso was ridiculing modern art. Even Georges Braque, his friend, was dismayed by this painting and said Picasso must have drunk petrol to spit fire onto the canvas. And even 100 years later, a British newspaper, The Guardian, wrote, "It's still so new, so troubling, it would be an insult to call it a masterpiece." What the critic meant by that was praise, in the sense that a masterpiece is something that's been assimilated, accepted, and become conventional. So 100 years later, this is still unconventional. There's something anarchic, ruthless about it that contains Dada, Marcel Duchamp, punk, he wrote. One characteristic, incidentally, of modern art is that the artist draws attention to the fact we are viewing a work of art. In other words, it's not a photographic representation of the world where we sort of get sucked into it and believe we're looking out of a window onto a scene. We know we're looking at a painting. Prior to the 20th century, prior to modern art, figurative forms, accurate depiction based in reality was a very common and many believed a necessity in producing art. Also, the other thing to note about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is there's no depth, it's flat, like a child's painting. And the motivation for flatness, which many artists followed, it leads on to abstraction. It's less clear. It might be honesty to the materials, in the sense that it is, in fact, just some pigments spread onto a flat board. So it's being honest. It might be an exploration of new effects. It might be, as we'll see, trying to depict the spiritual or reject any representational element that perhaps is better handled by photography. And in fact, in 1960, the art historian Clement Greenberg published Modernist Painting and argued that the essential and unique element in modern painting is its flatness. Finally, in 2007, Newsweek published an article about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and described it as the most influential work of art of the last 100 years. This is Kasimir Malevich's Black Square. And by the way, the craquelure you see is the result of its age. It was originally absolutely flat black with no texture or variation in tone. So the question many artists were asking at this time during the First World War, can art represent a spiritual world? Malevich believed it could, but he believed that to do that, he had to first reduce art to its basic essentials, its basic components, and then build up from there. He was born in Ukraine, but a lot of his working life was spent in Russia. He was there at the time of the Russian Revolution, and so there were many artists around him that were trying to discover new revolutionary forms of art. And he said he wanted art that was free from what he called the dead weight of the material world. He rejected what he called capitalist art, portraits of wealthy people, and what he called bits of nature, Madonnas and shameless nudes. He thought that art should represent the spiritual, the higher realms. Now you can see in this exhibition of his work where it is. The Black Square is in the top corner, in the same position a household in those days would place a religious icon. You can also see the Black Square was just the starting point, and he varied it to create increasingly complex shapes and patterns later in colour. Like, for example, this piece at Tate Modern. It's called Dynamic Suprematism, and Suprematism was the art movement founded by Malevich. He wrote, by suprematism, I mean the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art, rather than the visual depiction of objects. He was one of the founders of abstract art, although I must mention the Swedish artist Hilma af Klint, who started painting abstract paintings in 1906, and her work was inspired by the spiritual world as well, in her case based on the theosophical teachings of Helena Blavatsky. Now, the First World War had a profound impact on many artists. It raised the question, Is a society that engaged in a war in which 16 million died fundamentally wrong? And a group of artists who called themselves Dada thought the answer was a definite yes. They felt the war called into question every aspect of society, and their aim was therefore to destroy all traditional values using a new art and producing a new art that would replace the old. One of the artists, Hans Arp, later wrote, "Revolted by the butchery of the 1914 World War, we in Zurich devoted ourselves to the arts. While the guns rumbled in the distance, we sang, painted, made collages and wrote poems with all our might." Dada began in Switzerland at the Cabaret Voltaire and later spread to Berlin, New York and Paris. And Dada rejected logic and reason and started expressing nonsense and irrationality. They believed that the war resulted from the apathy of the middle classes and their failure to question their fundamental beliefs that had led to such carnage. Another Dadaist wrote, "We had lost confidence in our culture. Everything had to be demolished. At the Cabaret Voltaire, we began by shocking common sense, public opinion, education, institutions, museums, good taste, in short, the whole prevailing order." This is Salvador Dali's Autumnal Cannibalism. And it's a work of surrealist art. Surrealism began in the 1920s and in a way developed out of Dada. The question is that the surrealist asked, is our subconscious mind the most important and fundamental aspect of our everyday lives? Well, certainly Dalí, Sigmund Freud and many others thought it was. Let's look at this painting more closely. It needs to be looked at. There's what looks like a beach, and on it what looks like a chest of drawers, and on top there are two torsos. If you look closely, you can see the two figures are eating each other using bright silver cutlery. The one on the left looks female with soft milky white skin, and the one on the right is wearing a suit and could be male. The female figure has a right arm round the neck of the male and is slicing what at first looks like flesh with a knife. However, if you look more closely, you can see she's carving into her own breast, which she is cutting into. Her breast flows across the other figure over its shoulder. And what is happening here, this is a combination of cannibalism, self-cannibalism, sadism, masochism. The painting is about unrestrained consumption, and Dalí is drawing us into the horror by adding detail upon detail and encouraging us to look further and further into the painting until we find ourselves consumed by the painting. So what's the broader picture? It was 1936 it was painted, the year the Spanish Civil War started. And there were atrocities on both sides. 500,000 people died and a similar number fled the country. Now, Dalí took little interest in politics, and here he's representing the Civil War as an orgy of consumption, in the sense that he sees the Spanish people are eating themselves. As he wrote, these Iberian beings mutually devouring each other, and he saw it as a pure phenomenon of natural history. In other words, what else would you expect from people? This compares with a very different view that Picasso had. He considered the whole war a political phenomenon that he wanted to do something about, he wanted to change, and it was when he produced Guernica. But returning to Dalí, he was observing people as a scientist might observe ants. And in fact, in the painting, if you look at what I'm calling the woman's head, you can see there are ants surrounding a hole in the skin that looks like a peeled piece of fruit. Now, a lot of Dalí's symbolism relates to his life. He had a very strange childhood. On one occasion, he found an injured bat and looked after it. He put it in a box in the shed in the garden. But when he came down in the morning, he found that the living bat with a broken wing was being consumed alive by ants. And this had a profound effect on him, as many other events in his childhood did. For him, the ants represent decay and decomposition. And like many of his symbols, he has said they also refer to enormous sexual desire. So for Dalí, their death and decay and sexual desire and lovers destroying themselves through their sexual attraction is the symbolism that occurs in many of his paintings. He was tapping into the unconscious mind, and Sigmund Freud was profoundly influential on his work. In fact, all the Surrealists were influenced by Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. There were two ways that artists tapped into their unconscious mind. There was the dreams and trying to express what you see in that dream world. But there's also automatic painting, automatism. And in the 1940s and 50s, the abstract expressionists included the action painters, exemplified here by Jackson Pollock. There were also colour-filled painters like Mike Rothko. The question that Jackson Pollock's work raises is, if we react spontaneously, will we obtain a more truthful art? Now, these are some photographs of Pollock painting spontaneously, that is, without planning and forethought. He's dripping on splashing paint upon the canvas. Now, interestingly, recent scientific research has shown that his seemingly random patterns are in fact not random, but they're fractal. And therefore, they are actually very difficult to copy. By fractal, it's a mathematical term. I mean any pattern that is self-similar. That is, it looks the same at different levels of magnification. Think of a tree. The branches on the tree are themselves like little trees. And even the twigs on the branches are like little versions of the tree. And we find that in Pollock's work. So there is a truthfulness in his art that is produced spontaneously in that sense. There's an underlying patterns and patterns within patterns. And many abstract expressionists, Mark Rothko, for instance, the colour-filled painter, believe their work had an underlying mystical and spiritual significance. Big change again to pop art. Pop art is a movement that emerged, it emerged in the mid-1950s in Britain and the late 1950s, shortly after, in the US, although the British artists were influenced a lot by, for example, US magazines and cartoons. They were also influenced by Dada. Now, the Western world following World War II was increasingly filled with sophisticated commercial images in newspapers, on billboards, on television. And artists began to wonder, how do these differ from art? Are we living in one world of images and artists are just part of one enormous business to do with producing images? Some of them we use to sell toothpaste. Some of them we call fine art. Andy Warhol became a central figure. He was a commercial artist and he used commercial images to create his art. Now, on the left, we see here in this Marilyn Diptych 25 images of Marilyn Monroe in garish colours, 25 on the right in black and white. These are all silkscreen prints based on a photograph, a still from the film Niagara that she starred in 1953. But this work was produced in 1962, the year and shortly after Marilyn died from an overdose of sleeping pills. If you look at each image carefully, they're all slightly different because Warhol hand printed each image and changed the registration of each colour slightly. And in the right panel, he blurred and faded the images from left to right, suggesting the star's death. And the contrast between the bright colours and the monochrome also suggests life and death. And the title, Diptych, which is the name of a religious altar piece in two parts, suggests these two aspects, her life and her death. It's in a way a secular altar to the popular star Marilyn Monroe. And in fact, the repetition of the image is part of what makes a star. The repetition of seeing the person over and over again presented in different ways is one of the things that creates their stardom, their fame. So in other words, he's taken an image from the commercial world, manipulated it to create something with another level of meaning. Or perhaps is it, as Warhol thought, just different forms of doing business? The question here is, how far can an artwork be simplified and still be art? In the 60s and 70s, some artists like Carl Andre, Donald Judd and Frank Stella rejected abstract expressionism. They didn't like its focus on self-expression and spiritual meaning. They wanted to strip art back till it was just an anonymous piece with no distractions. And their work is called minimalist. And minimalism is challenging, controversial, particularly this work, which was known in the press at the time as the pile of bricks. It's actually more than it appears. The work consists of 120 fire bricks. It was originally one of 8 shapes in 2 combinations. All the shapes were placed on the floor in an exhibition area in one room. They weren't on a plinth, so they become part of the environment. They were all the shapes on the floor were 120 bricks, so they all had the same volume, so they were all equivalent, thus the title, equivalent 8. Now, Andre chose 120 as the number is mathematically interesting. It's got a number of divisors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 20, 24, 30, 40, 60, 120. The bricks were stacked in 2 layers, I think to prevent them drifting apart and to give the piece sufficient mass. And so the top layer only has 60 bricks. Now, 60 bricks can be assembled in 6 ways, but he chose just 4, 3 by 20, 4 by 15, 5 by 12, and as here, 6 by 10. He didn't use 2 bricks by 30 or 1 by 60, as I guess he thought they were too narrow and unstable. Now, in bricklaying, bricks laid end to end are called a stretcher course, and bricks laid side by side are called a header course. So each of the 4 combinations has 2 orientations. The bricks could be turned 90 degrees. So there were not 4 combinations. With the turning, there's 8. And this is the last one. This is why it's called equivalent 8. So all of these mathematical arrangements are part of what makes this apparently simple work interesting, I feel, but there's no real aesthetic interest or spiritual interest. It's there's no personal self-expression. And maybe you're not interested in all these mathematical possibilities, in which case you might not be interested at all. But I thought I would mention some of the background to this piece so that hopefully you can see it's more than just a pile of bricks. It's 8 piles of bricks. Now, conceptual artists believe that what's important is not the way a work of art is represented or the skill in producing it, but simply the idea behind it. The question is the idea behind a work of art in fact its most important aspect? Conceptual art, sometimes called conceptualism, is an art where the concepts or ideas involved in the work are the only thing that matters. They take precedence over the production, the materials, and so on. One conceptual artist, Sol LeWitt, wrote, "In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art." End quote. And in fact, the art might be made mechanically, or here in 1 and 3 chairs. Joseph Kosuth represents 1 chair 3 ways. There's a manufactured chair, which he didn't make, he just bought. There's a photograph of a chair, and in fact he didn't take the photograph. I think it's a photograph of the same chair, but I'm not absolutely sure. And a copy of a dictionary entry for the word chair. The installation is thus composed of an object, an image, and words. So is it art? And which representation of the chair is the most accurate? These are open-ended questions that can't be answered, but it's the sort of thinking, the sort of debate that Kosuth is encouraging, wants us to think about. He said that art is making meaning. He's trying to encourage us through his art to make meaning by thought and debate, by assembling these 3 alternative representations. And I won't go into all of the possible ways of discussing this, but let me just say a few sentences. What is a chair? We see many chair-like objects in our lives. We see stools, armchairs, deck chairs, even low tables that you can sit on. What is it about them that enables us all to agree on the use of a word or not? If it's got 3 legs, do we call it or 1 leg, do we call it a stool? When does one become another? When is a chair a stool? When does a chair become an armchair? The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein described language as a game. He wanted to bring into prominence the fact that speaking is part of an activity, a process. A chair, in fact, has no simple definition. It refers to objects that native speakers agree, more or less, to call a chair. And sometimes with some words there's a lot more debate than with other words. For example, there might be quite a long debate about the meaning of the word democracy. This is House by Rachel Whiteread. The question is, can an artwork change the way we see the world? Now, a bit of background. Whiteread was the first woman to win the Turner Prize in 1993 for this work, House. It's a life-size replica of the interior of a condemned terraced house in Bow, which is in London's East End. It took 2 years to plan, was made by spraying liquid concrete into the building's empty interior before its exterior walls were removed. It was completed on the 25th of October 1993 and demolished 11 weeks later on the 11th of January 1994. So as well as winning the Turner Prize, it also won a sort of ignoble prize, the Kay Foundation's award, for £40,000 for the worst work of art of the year. She refused the prize, but they then threatened to burn the money, so she accepted the money and gave it to charity. In fact, Kay Foundation, believe it or not, burnt £1 million the following year. I don't know whether that was intended as a work of art. Now, Whiteread made and makes many sculptures of the spaces within, around and under everyday objects, baths, sinks, chairs, floors. She calls them negative spaces, and it draws our attention to the forgotten spaces that we live in, around and within our everyday world, and she fixes them in time as public monuments. These spaces, of course, are normally occupied by human beings, and so these solidified spaces are symbols for the human absence, which draws our attention to human presence while refusing us entry. Coming back to the question, can an artwork change the way we see the world? One of the reasons I selected this question is Whiteread answered it in, I think, a very meaningful way. She's a pragmatic person. She said, "I don't think art changes the world in terms of stopping people dying of AIDS or of starvation or being homeless. But for an individual, it can enhance daily life, reflect our times, and in that sense, change the way you think and are." This is an artist, Joseph Beuys, with a much bigger question. Can a work of art change not just us, but the world? And he believed it could. This is called Lightning with Stag in its Glare. And Beuys toured the world lecturing on art. He is in fact now regarded as one of the most influential artists of the second half of the 20th century. He said in his lectures around the world, everybody is an artist. What he meant by that is, like it or not, the way we choose to live our lives, the decisions we make, determine what happens to us, what happens to the people around us, and eventually what happens to the world. So we are all making an artistic statement in the way we choose to run our lives, the decisions we make. And he felt that all art in this sense is intrinsically revolutionary, and wrote, "The revolution is us." He believed if we could pay attention to our relationship with nature, it would transform society. He believed our lives all depend on vast forces of nature that are outside our control. We can destroy them, of course, but we can't control them. If a tsunami hits our shores, or an earthquake destroys our buildings, or a volcano erupts, we're powerless to even control it or resist it. So come back to this work. Look at this. The first thing to say is that he wasn't interested in the materials or the exact form of the work. He was conveying ideas. And the title, I think, is slightly misleading. You might expect to find a stag, a realistic stag with antlers and a bolt of lightning in the way it's conventionally drawn. But as I said, objects weren't important to Beuys, and what he's done, he's the large triangular object at the back is actually bronze. Originally, when he first showed this work, it was clay, and it's the lightning strike. Like lightning, it's powerful and potentially dangerous. The lightning is an elemental force, and it's illuminating a group of creatures. The stag is the silver object in the middle. Originally, it was an ironing board, but Beuys remade it using cast aluminium. Now, since childhood, Beuys had been interested in Northern European folklore, in which certain animals are endowed with mystical powers, and in particular the stag had a particular significance. It was a spiritual guide for him in times of danger and distress. And in folklore, it's a symbol of rebirth and renewal because it annually sheds its antlers and regrows them. The cart at the back with the three wheels represents a goat, one of the first animals to be domesticated, so it's a symbol of human domestication. The lumps on the floor, which were originally clay wrapped around tools from his workshop, like chisels, and are now cast in bronze. They represent primordial, blind, worm-like creatures wiggling on the floor. So there's a reference here back to the beginning of evolution of animals. The box on a tripod on the left has, you can't really see it here, but has a small compass on top, and it's called Boothia Felix. And this is actually an area in the northern part of Canada, and it was named after Felix Booth, who was the promoter of an expedition to locate the magnetic north. And that's another reference here. Magnetic north has actually moved since then, so it's no longer in Boothia Felix. But it's a reference by Beuys of the forces of nature and our relationship to them. Beuys, incidentally, was one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany, and he wants us to appreciate the interconnectedness between all life forms and create a path towards an ecologically sustainable future. Should we return to the power of the image and the skill of the artists? There are artists who think we should. I'll show you a few. And this artist, Vic Harris, took a time-lapse video of him painting this portrait of his son. This art movement is known as photorealism, or sometimes hyperrealism, and its aim is typically to reproduce a photograph to draw attention both to the fact it's a painting, and not all photorealist artists have that in mind. Some of them want to achieve something that is indistinguishable from a photograph. And through that, to reclaim the image in a world flooded with images through the skill and the time and the effort expended by the artist. So the artist is retrieving the power of the image by the skill and time and effort that they choose to put into it. It was reaction in some ways against minimalism and pop art and abstract expressionism. And it was a small number of artists started this trend and produced these detailed, unidealized representations, many initially of banal, mundane, or sometimes sordid aspects of life. They do use photographs, typically several photographs, to gather the information to create the painting. And the use of photographs, when these images were first produced, met with intense criticism in the press. This is in the late 1960s. Despite the fact that artists have been using visual devices like camera obscura since at least the 15th century. I'll give you a couple more examples. This is one of the earliest artists to work as a photorealist, Richard Estes, along with there are others, Chuck Close, Ralph Goings. These were some of the first artists to attempt to exactly replicate a photographic image, and they're generally they are thought of as the founders of the movement. Richard Estes studied fine art in Chicago, and he was interested in the realistic paintings of Edgar Degas, Edward Hopper and Thomas Eakins. He moved to New York. He worked as a graphic artist, but by 1966 he was financially independent and was able to paint full time. He used photographs, typically painted buildings. He painted buildings in daylight, and the atmosphere he said he wanted to create was a vacant and quiet Sunday morning. So generally the shadows are long and there's few people around. Another photorealist is David Eichenberg, an American artist born in Ohio. Still continues to paint photorealistic portraits and cityscapes. He has his own website where you can see a number of his works. He won third place in the 2010 BP Portrait Awards given by the National Portrait Gallery. The question, should we return to the power of the image and the skill of the artists? You might wonder what interest there is in a painting that's so close to a photograph as to be indistinguishable. I think the answer, because I found many people are. They're amazed by it and they value the sheer skill of the artist. Now, modern art has been extended by technologies. So can these new technologies be used to expand the range of artistic expression? This is The Quintet of the Astonished, a video by Bill Viola. I've just switched it on. Video art, unlike conventional film, tends not to employ actors, usually contains no dialogue, may have no discernible narrative or plot, or adhere to any of the other conventions that generally define motion pictures as entertainment. So they're not intended as entertainment as such. Bill Viola has dealt with themes of perception, memory, self-awareness, And in this series, the series is called The Passions. He's dealing with emotion. The series was begun in 2000, and in these works he grapples with the problem: how do we convey the power and the complexity of emotion? And he immersed himself in studying the conventional expression of emotion. He looked at older paintings, theories of emotional expression. He looked at the work, that the codification of emotions by the 17th century French painter Charles Le Brun. And this is one of the first works in that series, The Passions, the Quintet of the Astonished. It was commissioned by the National Gallery in London, and it was inspired by this painting, Hieronymus Bosch, Christ Crowned with Thorns. It was shot on high-speed film, which is, and it's shown in slow motion, dramatically slowed down, and it's an intense tableau of shifting and momentary emotions. The relationship, incidentally, between the figures in his video was unplanned, and they exist in varying intensities over the work's duration. The question here, in a way, is a negative one. Has sale price become a measure of an artwork's value? Do we measure the value of a work of art by how much it sells for? If so, how can an artist escape from this market-driven valuation of what they do? Well, one way is performance art, because it only exists for the length of the performance. It can't be packaged and resold. You could, of course, produce a video, but that's not the same thing. It doesn't capture the uniqueness of the performance. Performance art may be scripted or unscripted, random or carefully orchestrated, spontaneous or carefully planned, and with or without audience participation. The aim, though, is to destroy the power of the art market, to create something original. And here, between March the 14th and May the 31st, 2010, the Museum of Modern Art held a major retrospective of the work of Marina Abramovich. It was, in fact, the biggest exhibition of performance art in MoMA's history. During the exhibition, she performed this work called The Artist is Present for 736.5 hours, where she sat silently, statically, unmoving, immobile in the museum's atrium, while spectators, who in the end were queuing round the block, were invited to take turns and sit opposite her. Abramovich sat in a rectangle drawn with tape on the floor, and visitors waited in line and were invited to sit individually across from her while she maintained eye contact with them. The visitors could do what they wanted, but they were asked not to speak. And within a few days, the atrium became packed with visitors, and as I said, they ended up queuing round the block because they all wanted to sit in front of Abramovich. Most visitors sat for about 5 minutes or less. There was no disruption in the queue. On the last day, I think one visitor waiting in line, queuing, vomited, and another began to take their clothes off and I think were taken out by the security guards. There was tension among the visitors waiting in line because for every minute each person sat there, it was less time to spend with Abramovich for the people waiting in queue. And if you were further back in the queue, you might have never reach her if people were taking too long. She sat across from 1,545 sitters. They were asked not to touch her or speak. and she didn't react, except occasionally a sitter would break down and cry, and she would then cry without moving. I'm coming to the end now, my last questions. Step 15, the 15th question. Can art be taken to the streets? On the 21st of August 2015, Banksy opened Dismaland. It's a large-scale show lampooning Disneyland, and it closed permanently a month later, 27th of September 2015. It was located in a holiday town, Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, England. Banksy wrote, "When you go to an art gallery, you're simply a tourist looking at the trophy cabinet of a few millionaires. The question is, can we get away from that? Can art be taken to the streets? That is, can we escape the gallery, the dealer, the exhibition, and art for multimillionaires, and engage with the life of everyday people?" It was traditional Banksy work. It was shrouded in secrecy before it was open. No one still knows who Banksy is. It was apocalyptic. It was anti-consumerist. It was a social critique of celebrity culture. It was the bulk of the art was created by dozens of artists. The brochure said, "Are you looking for an alternative to the soulless, sugar-coated banality of the average family day out? Or just somewhere cheaper? Then this is the place for you. A new, chaotic world where you can escape from mindless escapism." The park was staffed by morose Dismaland employees who were uninterested in the visitors, were unhelpful, and weren't even remotely informative. And when you queued to get in, there was an uncomfortable, intentionally awkward security screening, completely unnecessary. And of course, when you exited, you had to exit through a gift shop. I don't think modern art is to do with answers, as I think I've made clear. That's why I phrased it as a series of thought-provoking questions. There isn't a right answer, but I hope the questions have provoked some thoughts and at least made you smile when looking at some of the works. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be bringing you another talk soon on Western art. So goodbye for now.